Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here and to the Japanese Embassy for giving us the space to talk. Perhaps the man I'm going to talk a little bit about would not be so unaware of the crisis in Parliament, given that he cut his teeth at the addled Parliament of 1614, the great quarrel between the House of Lords and Commons. But I'm going to talk first about a story that is familiar in a large number of Asian and Middle Eastern cultures. And this will be perhaps familiar to, or at least one of these images may be familiar to some of you. It's the one about a group of blind men meeting an elephant. You'll remember this, won't you? It's a story where every man tries to figure out what this thing is. One of them touches the tail and says, well, obviously this is a rope. Another touches an ear and thinks it's one of those old-fashioned ceiling fans that wafts about. One of them bumps against the side of the elephant and says, I don't know what you're talking about. This is obviously a wall. And the fourth one happens to bump against one of the legs of the elephant and says, well, all of you are obviously wrong. We're standing in front of a mansion, and these are two pillars on either side of the mansion. Drawing on each of his own specific experience. Each of them tries to explain the whole thing by the part they encounter. And in a way, I'd argue that encounters with new worlds are pretty much exactly like that. A new world is hardly ever completely new. When we encounter a new place for the first time, if you cast your mind back to the first time you went to a place, you'll remember that our response of it is framed by our previous experience and by our memories. Some relevant, some completely irrelevant and inaccurate, but they're powerful nevertheless, and equally important. To a blind man, an elephant's tail will always be like a rope, because that's the one thing that they can compare. He could compare it to. It is only when we put one man's rope next to another man's wall, next to another man's fan, another man's pillar, that the whole elephant begins to take shape, perhaps. Others have spoken about the context in a way already, so I'm not going to go into great detail. But my given brief is to put the Japanese contact, the Anglo-Japanese contact, within a global context. So it's worth kind of remembering England's relative importance and global awareness in this period. And it's important remembering that, of course, this island nation was not quite an island nation in that sense. It was, even that island was being shared with other nations in this period, which we tend to forget. But the bigger issue for the English, and not so much for the crown as for the merchants, as Tim had pointed out, was the little minor problem of, oh gosh, what to do with all that English wool? Lovingly grown on English sheep, soaked by English rain. But there was another problem, which is England's appetite for luxuries that were coming in from Asian countries. So in some senses, this island nation is both an island nation and not. If you were walking down the streets of London in this period, you were quite likely to come across a man wearing a beaver hat that had been imported from Northern America, as you were to pop into a pub and see people smoking tobacco from the Virginia colonies. So there's a great deal of engagement, sometimes oblique, going on. It's not a wonder that a bunch of actors decide, including one named William Shakespeare, decide to open a theatre called the Globe on the banks of the Thames in this period. If you couldn't go out to the world, for the payment of about a penny or halfpenny, would come to you. But this is, of course, England before empire as well. So just to put this into context for you, the two faces you've seen, of course, are James the First of England, James the Sixth of Scotland, and his predecessor, Elizabeth the First. And the moment that I talk about in Courting India, which is the first English embassy to India, where Sir Thomas Roe is sent to get those all-important trading licenses, just as the English would be kind of pleading for trading licenses in Japan in the previous kind of couple of years. There's already behind all of this a sense of belatedness, of course. And that belatedness is partly because of the global trade routes that we see covered here. The Ottomans, the Safavids in Persia, and the Mughals in northern India, along with Ming China, at this point cover most of world economy, within which even the Portuguese are relatively late entrant. And this is something that from our Eurocentric perspective, we sometimes forget, that trade connections in all these areas of the world had been continuing for centuries before the Europeans land or enter those trade routes. So just to give you an example of the kind of difference in scale we are talking about on that larger global scale, I'll take the one that I've been thinking and writing over the past decade about, and that's the Mughals in northern India. The sense of difference in space and economy is quite striking. The Mughal empire in this period is about 1.24 million square miles and rules over 150 million people. One of the East India Company's servants in this period write about the annual revenue of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who's a direct contemporary of James I, and talk about how it's about 54 million sterling in this period. So that's Jahangir's personal annual revenue, which is about 100 times the annual national revenue of England. So it's not a wonder that the English at this point want to make these connections with Asia or the Indies. And India or Indies is a very flexible term, as we all know. And the EIC is a fairly new entrant. One of the reasons why the Japanese connections is so particularly important is because of that implicit presence, of course, of the Portuguese, who have hold of the South American silver mines. Again, another thing that I think is hugely important to think about. All those people wanting their luxury goods from South Asia and Asian countries in general, if you want to wander down the Royal Exchange or the New Exchange in 17th century London, well, in order to buy your fancy beaver hat, to keep your head warm, you needed to spend silver. So there was a huge amount of debate in England about English silver being drained away from the country. Where would you get silver from? Japan was one of those places where you'd go to. So already this world is deeply interconnected, and I'm just going to give you one little example of those interconnections. And this is a story that I've talked about before. This is long before the East India Company has even got its trading license. It's still a glint in the eyes of London merchants. 1583 in Goa, the first English trading ship that has been sent to scope out India as a trading area makes landfall. And they're promptly, as soon as they land, they're promptly put in prison. Why? The English are fairly certain that it's because the Portuguese are a mean bunch. They don't want them there as competitors. Yes, that is partly the case. But Goa is also the head of the Portuguese Estado de Indies at this point. It's also the point, the place where a group of 4 Japanese boys have made landfall roughly in that same period. Alessandro Valiano, who's the head of the Jesuit Church, has brought them over. They're on their way to the Vatican. And we have Valiano's letter at this point saying, whatever you do, don't let the Japanese cross paths with any pesky Protestants. Because what we don't want happening is the Japanese getting hold wind of the break within the Catholic Church, within the church as a whole in this period. So in a way, for me, one of the really interesting things about this point is a meeting that doesn't happen. We've been talking a lot about cultural exchanges that happened, but this is a point where a meeting doesn't happen between the English and the Japanese. I've got the yellow warning sign of dread up already, but I'm going to leave you with that moment of absence as well as presences. Thank you.